on the riddles on Dottie something.
Yeah.
Figure out them.
I told you. Your wife's talking about that? Someone asked me, how do you know?
Oh yeah. It was Gamaliel.
Yeah, I can ask. It was like, well, how can it be that there's no mention anywhere?
But also, we're studying a very, very profound sugya. Just to give you an example of how much literature there is on this sugya that we want to touch, perhaps the tip of the iceberg. In the Otzer HaYunim that I became fond of in the last 2 weeks, he's got an article called Aguna that just goes on and on and on in very small print. And I started going through, navigating through this piece, and we'll see how much we can accomplish, get a taste of what's going on here. See, part of what I want you to take out of these is just to realize where in Shas you'll find, hityachasut, to that particular sugya. Like, for example, we spoke about the mitzvah of chalitza on one occasion. We spoke about kituse mechta shiura. We spoke about ochel nevelos and feeding a nevela to a child, and so forth and so on. And you might not know where in Shas to look. Yevamot seems to be like a tremendous resource for so many different Shas sugyas. Now, I want to study through another Shas sugya, and that's called Eid Echad Nemed B'Yisur. Now, the Torah says, Al Pi Shnayim Eidim Yochim. And yet, we're going to see that the Gemara establishes that if one witness would testify that a woman's husband died, based on the testimony of that witness, again, there'll be many conditions, we can allow her to get married. And the Rashba in Shuvas is so perplexed by this. He says, how could that be? The Torah says, Al Pi Shnayim Eidim Yochim. How could you rely on the testimony of one aid? And he is so perturbed by this question that he comes to the conclusion that when we allow a woman to get married, based on the testimony of one aid, we are activating the principle of afkeinu l'rabbanan l'kedusha binu. That when a person marries a woman, he says, Harei at al kedas Moshe v'Yisrael, which means al manas, on the condition that Moshe v'Yisrael will accept my marriage. And if it's an illegal marriage, then the Rabbanan could come along and be mafkia the kedusha, because he the Mekadesh gave authority to the Rabbanan. So this is the way the Rashba understands the operation of Eid Echad in Misa Sabah. So that's going to be one part of our discussion today, and we'll try to find alternatives because we don't see anywhere in any sugya Yevamos, and over again the Gemara relies on one aid, that the Gemara is based on Inu Rabbanan L'Kedusha. The part of the sugya that we have to study, equally engaging, is the question of a woman who testifies about her own. And that's the Manasa Isha, based Bailing. And the entire last section of Masechet Yevamos really addresses this question. When and under what conditions do we believe a woman to testify that her husband died? Now, if we come to the conclusion that Eid Echad Nemed B'Yisur, at least he's got one advantage, and that is he's an Eid Kosher. But in the case of an Isha, she's got two strikes against her, not just one. First of all, an Isha is Psula Liedus, and secondly, she's a Baldava. She's testifying about herself. We never accept testimony about oneself. In fact, the Gemara tells us in a number of places, Makkas and Hedrin, that if a person testifies about themselves, like for example, Plonim Ravani Lurtzoni, so he incriminates himself, we don't trust him. Unbelievable. The man is admitting his guilt, and we don't rely on him, which is one of the great features of Jewish law, because in secular law, self-incrimination is accepted in a court. And that's what brings to the whole problem of, plea bargaining, because we try to get a guy to admit he might be totally innocent. but he'd rather get away with, 2 years in the clink than 20 years in the clink. But in halacha, there is no such problem. There's no self. And if Aldover is not trusted, so how can we trust a woman who's testifying about herself that she's no longer an HSH and she's allowed to get married? So these are some of the issues that we want to discuss. Now, with regard to Eid Echad Nemen B'Surit and how it applies in the case of an Eid testified that this woman's husband died, I'm going to trust him. We have a fascinating Tosas HaRosh. The Tosas HaRosh presents one opinion in the name of Yesh Misha Omer, some anonymous Rishon, and then he disagrees. And the Tosas HaRosh, I'll just read to you a little part of it. He says, and this is in the page that I just sent you now, if you have it in the Wednesday group. He says, Eid Echad Min Adin Mevarer Kimo Shnayim. Okay, so we're on the left column on a page that says Mem Zayin on it. Second paragraph, first major paragraph. That's the key word here, Mevarer. According to this opinion, the first opinion in Tosas HaRosh, what is the purpose of Eidin, of Eidus? When Bezdin is Makabel Eidus, and the Torah says, Al Pishnayim Eidin, that's a birur. The Torah says we rely on 2 Eidin to clarify the suffering. And now the question arises, why do you rely on 2 Eidin? Because they are trustworthy. We don't think that they would perjure themselves and lie in Bezdin. What about 1 Eid? To the same extent that the Torah is relying on 2 Eidim because they're trustworthy, why not rely on 1 Eid? And if you can tell me, well, 1 Eid is not convincing enough, so why not require 3 Eidim? There's no reason, there's no rhyme or reason why why it stops, it falls at 2 Eidim. Not 1, not 3, not 100, but 2 Eidim. So Tosas HaRosh, in the name of this first Yeshach sovereign, says that, you know what? This is a Gzeras HaKosim. This is something that the Torah says. He calls it a Gzeras Melech. Shelo lachtoch hadin al pi edus eid echad. So again, as far as birur is concerned, as far as trusting, as far as credibility is concerned, there's no difference between 1 Eid and 2 Eid. If they're ksherim, then they're monim. Every Jew has a cheskas nemanus, and there's no reason to reject 1 Eid. But it's Gzeras HaMelech. The Torah says, you know what? We're not going to offer any sort of ruling and hand down a verdict without 2 Eidim. That equals Gzeras HaMelech. So if this be the case, that we're talking about Gzeras HaMelech, then how can we believe 1 thing to testify Mace BiIyun? How can we rely on 1 Eid? The Torah says we need 2 Eidim. And Ein Dover Shebe'erva Pachos Mishnayim. We need 2 Eidim. And he writes that the only way we can understand this concept of relying on 1 Eid is that we're going to have to introduce some sort of new svara over here. And what is this new svara? That if Bezdin is convinced, is persuaded, if they feel they have enough evidence to establish that she died, then they will allow her to get remarried based on evidence. In other words, Eid Echad is not a parsha of Nemanis, a parsha of Eidus, because the Torah said we cannot rely on 1 Eid. The only way we can justify relying on 1 Eid is by saying that the Torah uses 2 Eidim for the birur of Eidus. But if we could find another method, another approach to birur, that means we could clarify with evidence that's absolutely convincing and it's certain and it's reliable, even though it's not the evidence of what? Of Eidus. It doesn't have the Gushpak, it doesn't have the Chaloshem Eidus. It doesn't matter, as long as it's a birur. And based on this, we begin to wonder if we can justify the fact that the Gemara's, all the Sugis in Yevamot limit with different conditions the reliability of Eid Echad. And we'll go through those just very quickly in a second. But just to just to get the overall picture that we're dealing with. The framework is the following. We're going to find that the Gemara in many situations is not going to rely on Eid Echad. If Eid Echad would be believed as Eidus, if not for the Gzeres HaMelech, that you need 2 Eidim minimum, and one is not reliable, then we would have no limitations. Well, what are these limitations? So this is called Daika Umitzvah. Okay, we'll come back to that in just a minute, but just that you have it from the top, Daika Umitzvah means that she would not allow herself to get married unless she was certain that her husband died. And the reason for that is because if her husband's alive, then she's got serious problems. And that's called kilkul. Number one, she's asur al zelzeh. Number two, she cannot obviate the problem of zerus. I mean, tremendous knossos and penalties that are going to apply to her because she relied. I would stand up for you, but I'm already standing. So,
or is that maybe the mechanism they're relying on?
So there are 2 ways of understanding it. One way of understanding it is now we have a different method, a different derech, a different approach to why we rely on Eid, but it's not B'Torah's Eid, it's a different birur. And if it's birur, then we're going to add A plus B. We're going to need to add and enhance the credibility of the Eid Echad, a principle called Isha Daiku principle. But again, it's not so smooth. It's not so easy to understand this because we just finished saying Gzeres HaMelech. Gzeres HaMelech means that the Eid Echad is trustworthy, no less than 2 Eidim. It's only Gzeres HaMelech. We have no logic to justify why the Torah doesn't rely on 1 Eid. Because again, as we said before, 1 Eid is equal to 2 Eidim, is equal to 3 Eidim, is equal to 100 Eidim. If he has the Nemonis of Eidus. Ella, what the Torah says, he has no Eidus. So he has no Eidus. So now we should fall back on some sort of general concept that we have a birur because the Torah trusts 1 Eid. And if we have a birur, we've clarified beyond the shadow of a doubt, we have ample evidence to assume that his wife died. Excuse me, that her husband died. Then once we have that evidence, why do I have to add Daiku Mitzvah? Now, how do I know that Eid Echad alone is not believed to testify that he died? How do I know that I need to add Daiku? So that is 3 different sugyas. Each one is predicated on this very same assumption that we need Daiku Mitzvah. And all these 3 sugyas are in the end of Masechet Yevamot, which we hope to make a siyum on tomorrow. For those who are learning the Daf. And this is on the right column on the same page of Zion on a paragraph that starts with sugyos. Do you see that? He says there are 3 sugyos in 3 places. This is line 5 of that paragraph. Number 1, Eid Echad BiIyun. She'im atamu mishum deika u'mitzvah shel sheyesh achshor shemes onas hayav. Get this. A woman is married to someone without any children, and he has a brother. He's going to testify in such a way that she won't fall for Yibum. How does she do that? She says that we went out to Medina Sayyam, and there I had a child, and my husband died before my childhood. It's a tragic situation, but the bottom line is that according to her testimony, she doesn't fall for Yibum. Now we could get the same exact testimony from 1 Eid, and the Gemara says, no, we're not going to rely on that 1 Eid. Why? Because we don't have Daiku Mitzvah. Why don't we have Daiku Mitzvah? She has vested interest in testifying that her son outlived her husband so that she doesn't fall for evil because she hates the Yevamot. Now, the last thing in the world she wants to do is get married to the Yevamot. Another sugya, right? That's a sugya on Tzadi Gimel. Then he has another sugya on Kuf Tes Vav. Eid Echad b'Milchama. And the Gemara says that we're not going to rely on Daika Mitzvah in the case of Milchama because she has the tendency of conjecturing, if we can use that word, that her husband died. I mean, again, I don't want to describe a bloody battlefield, but everyone's dying like flies in that battle. And she assumed there's her husband lying, with swords in his body, and he also died. So she doesn't have that daikun mitzvah because she's tempted to think, based on the circumstances, make that last leap of faith that her husband died. In such a case, the Gemara says Eid Echad is not believed. And a third sugya, this is we're doing like an overview of the last half second Yevamot in Kufte Zayin Amid Beis, and that's a case of Katan. We know that there's disharmony between him and her. Therefore, we believe that she has vested interest in testifying that her husband died. And what's going to happen if her husband, in fact, is alive? Is Teitze Mizeh Mizeh, but she doesn't mind that. She doesn't mind that. Why? Because she just wants to get out of this marriage. Any way, how, shape, or form. So there's no daikun mitzvah. You're left with Eid Echad, and Echad, pure Eid Echad. If it's only Eid Echad, we're not going to rely on Eid Echad. So the question now becomes, why don't we rely on Eid Echad according to the first opinion? Odmat, we'll see the second opinion in Tosafot Rosh, that says that if not for the Gzeres HaMelech, we would rely on the Nemonis of Eid Echad. So why do we need to add daikun mitzvah? So he writes over here that in the case of Mitzvah Sabal,
Which page are you on? I'm sorry.
Mem Zayin, I sent it to you. I sent it to you.
I don't think we
in the
have. I think you sent Mem Hey again. Sent the wrong one. Sent Mem Hey again.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Let me take a quick. Well, who's a good photographer? Or who has it? You have a camera, so I don't have to open my camera.
What are the two?
This is so great. You don't even need a photocopy anymore.
I cut off a bit of the right side, but you should see the left. Oh,
So we're going to just summarize this last point over here. This is the first opinion in Tosafot Rosh. And he says that basically, Eid Echad, because the Torah says you don't rely on Eid Echad, it comes under a different category. Eid Echad is not a category of Nemonis and Eidus. It's all a question of Birur. And he says that whenever we have a reason to suspect that maybe he might be lying, and there's not 100% clarification and evidence, then we're going to have to rely on daikun mitzvah together with the Eid Echad, and we're going to add 1 + 1, and hopefully it equals 2. I always thought that it's 0 + 0 = 0, but Tosafot Rosh says it's 1 + 1 = 2, and now we have something equivalent in its power and its reliability to 2 Eid. What do we have? We have Eid Echad plus daikun mitzvah, except for those 3 exceptional cases. And once we have those 2 together, then we have a birur that allows us to circumvent the need for 2 Eid. Because the whole purpose of 2 Eidim is to be mavarer that in fact her husband died. Now we have a birur through another method, another channel, and that's by adding Eid Echad together with daikun. But then he disagrees, and that's at the end of this paragraph on the left column. Ulam hatosvis harosh dacha rayotzam. He rejects all the proofs. And he says, "V'nira midvarav," that yesh sad lomar she'ein zug zeras hakosim el chisaron benemonus ubebiru. This is interesting. The Tosafot Rosh wants to claim, forget about zeras hakosim. This is not zeras hakosim. The Torah says we cannot rely on 1 Eid. Maybe he wasn't sure. Maybe he's lying. Maybe he has a wrong perspective. The Torah wants to see a gibui, we want to see a second opinion, right? Like, for example, with medicine, right? So you want to get a second opinion. We need here a second opinion. And together, the 2 Eidim form a kat, a group, a power of Eidus, which is enough to convince us of any question. It gives us absolute certainty. But 1 Eid? Listen, buddy, I'm not so sure. I'm not so convinced that 1 Eid is telling the truth. Okay. Now at this point, we go back to this page over here. So let's just quickly take a look at this this page, which again, it should look like this in your. The Mishnah says on Daf Kuf Yudalad Amud Beis that if she and her husband went to Medina Sayyam, if there's no ketata between them, in other words, they're living in, shall we say, a harmonious marital relationship, that's condition number one. Condition number two, the shalom ba'olah, right? There's no milchama. Uba v'yama meis baili tinase. So this is the famous breakthrough Mishnah that we trust one woman, and that is the woman who's married to this husband, to testify that her husband died. But we need two conditions. Number one, if there's chashov kitata beinena, then we assume that she might be lying, despite the repercussions. If her husband comes back on 2 feet, alive and well, and all the terrible things that are going to happen to her, nevertheless, she has ketata, she just wants to get out of this marriage. Number two, another condition that has to be met, it's not shas milchama. Because if it's shas milchama, then didamila. Didamila means she's going to make that conjecture, and she's going to assume based on what she sees that her husband's gone. But in any event, we see that she is believed. There's going to be a machlokes between Beis Hillel and Beit Shammai, but at the end, Chazru Beis Hillel lahoros Beit Shammai, one of those rare occasions where Beis Hillel conceded to the position of Beit Shammai, namely that we believe a woman to testify that her husband died. We're going to allow her to get remarried. There's also sugi Yevamot stuff, tzadi daled. These are all the sugis. Okay, then. So now we're going to analyze the following question: what is the relationship between these two halachas? Halacha number one, that we rely on the testimony of Eid Echad. That's conditional, that we have an additional proof, which is called Daiko Mitzvah. And now we have another halacha that we rely on the testimony of her, of the wife. Are those two really one and the same? Is the credibility, the reliability of a woman the same as Eid Echad? Again, you'll ask me, well, how could it be the same as Eid Echad? Eid Echad is only a kosher Eidus, not a apostle, especially in the Davar Shabbat. But the answer is going to be that she now, because she has the same credibility, again, if it's Shalom Beino, and Shalom Ba'olah, as any establishment of proof, right? So let's go now according to the first opinion of Tosa Rosh. If the first opinion of Tosa Rosh is accepted, namely that Eid Echad is another method which the Torah relies on, it's not Eidus, it's Birur, then she can convince us, persuade us to create that Birur no less than an Eid Echad. Right? Just like we say in an Eid Echad is Birur, so too she can create that Birur. And why? Because she's afraid of the repercussions. If she's normal and she has a good, healthy marital relationship and there's no milchama going on, then all things equal, she's afraid that if he comes walking in on 2 feet, karama, as we say, look at the repercussions. And therefore, she's believed no less than 8 F. That's one way of learning.
No, but still not apples to apples. On these conditions, you're almost bootstrapping your argument by saying, "Oh, wait, we believe, or that's only if you have these 2 conditions." So those conditions are what's really creating the error, not.
Well, yes and no, Eli, because those conditions are really just there to avoid 2 possibilities. Number one, that she's mishakeres, has vested interest in the law, fabricated the whole stuff, and to reject bididami, that she, can't. But after you've rejected those 2 possibilities, then you come back to.
She doesn't stand on her own as an 8 echad. Meaning we say that these 2 conditions are met, then we allow her testimony to be beer. But it's only beer if you have it's like a table with legs. If you don't have the other 2 legs, it's not going to stand.
Right, but keep in mind, Eli, that even Eid Echad is not a total beer. It's not an independent, absolute beer. We need Daiku Mitzvah. the common denominator, right? What we call in Hebrew hamachaneh mishutav, is going to be persuading Bezdin that the husband died. There are two ways of persuading Bezdin, either with Eid Echad plus Taikum or our testimony. She actually saw him die. That's what she's claiming. And we're going to rely on her because she's persuaded us that this is the truth. So it's all about truth. It's all about establishing the truth. We have a substitute to Eidos. We thought that the only way of establishing the truth in Dorish Mever is to Eidim. Now we have another method. And what is that method? It's either Eid Echad plus Taikum Mitzvah, or it's her testimony, as long as we don't have any reason to think that she's lying. Okay?
No, I was just going to say, you frame it as two different scenarios, which is Eid Echad and Daiko Mitzvah, and the other one being for testimony. But aren't they one and the same? In other words, we're actually, the chiddush here is that you can actually combine the two. In other words, she serves as her own Eid Echad, and she's the one we're relying on as Daiko Mitzvah, because the preconditions have been met, and there's no reason that.
Just one second, I just want to make sure we're on the same page. Taikum Mitzvah means the following. She doesn't know that he died. It's not like the case that we're dealing with now, where she saw him die. She heard through the grapevine. So she goes and investigates, and she has this one, she has that one. Did anyone see him come up from the water? Has he showed up? Did somebody see his face on Facebook? I don't know. She does all the clarifications that she can. And then she goes ahead and marries another person. That whole composition gives us Daikum Mitzvah and allows the Eid Echad to convince us that her husband died. The other method that we're talking about now is radically different. She's not saying, well, I heard rumors and I checked it out, and all the tzaddikim in the whole country are saying he died, and I'm convinced, and I'm going to go ahead and prove it. How convinced I am, I'm going to marry someone. No. She is testifying. I was there when he died. Ich hab gewesen dort und ist gestorben. I was auf an art, as we say here. And at this point, we're saying it's all the same. What do I mean it's all the same? Al pi halacha, it gets to the same goal. The goal line here is that we are persuaded. That's called BiIyun. And this approach, he says, in the name of the Atzei Arozim. Who is the Atzei Arozim? All I can tell you is his name was Rabbi Noach Chaim Tzvi Maya. So if anybody has Google, maybe you can tell me who the man was. I was in Rav Soloveitchik's shir for a good number of years. He never quoted the Atzei Arozim. But again, maybe they'll open up a new shkuna here in Efrat called Arazim. I don't know, it's also growth. I don't know. I'm always looking for new names so that they'll build a new neighborhood and I can afford the prices. So I was thinking maybe they should call the next neighborhood Etrog or Lulav or something. But anyway, so the Atzei Arozim says, you see this? Okay, so everybody's on the same page. We're on Mem Hey, if you want to see it inside. We're on the right column. Right, that was the first of these pages, the right column. And we're in the third paragraph. You see that? Ubesefer Atzei Arozim. This is a Sefer Chidushim on Even Ezer. Chasav shenemanu sa. All this nemanus that we had in all these sources on this page, Shela Yishahu kechol eid echad. We're assuming that there's no chashash sheker because there's harmony between them. There's no milchama. And just like in Eid Echad, we don't think he's lying and he's fabricating the truth when he says that her husband died. So too, we rely on her testimony. Ad kan. And from here on in, for the balance of this entire collection, an anthology of like who's who amongst Rishonim and Achronim, he tries to slug up the Atzei Arozim and to prove that Eidus Isha, when she testifies on her own husband, it's a whole new category, a whole new ballgame. And the most fascinating of these proofs is the Yerushalmi, which you'll see on the bottom right column. The Omnam. You see a paragraph that starts the Omnam. Now, I was not able to find this Yerushalmi because as Chatoyri Mazkir, I have trouble enough with the Bavli. but we'll rely on his quote of the Yerushalmi. Before that, let's take a look for a moment in the Rambam. Rambam, as you know, is very impacted by the Yerushalmi. So the Rambam on this page that I keep showing you, which is the fourth source on your page, Hilchos Gerus and Perikei Beis, the Rambam says, Misha Hufsa Kwaishis, so we know that this woman is married. She and her husband went out to the seven seas, and his peace, Ubav Yamra Meis Baili Nemenes. Fine, she's believed. And that means one of two things. If her husband died and left the Yavam childless, then she marries the Yavam. If not, she can marry someone else. They have children and so forth and so on. And now the Rambam is going to offer an entire long-winded, atypical explanation as to why we trust this woman who testifies that her husband dies. Chazaka. Again, it sounds like we're dealing with what? Are we dealing with edus, or we're dealing with like circumstantial evidence and birur? Chazaka. What does the word chazaka mean?
Please explain what
it's a birur. It's a robe. Chazaka is another way of saying like ain't other porea, tosmano, or chazaka based on balchovo. We have also psychological robes that we call chazaka, and they're based on the teva of b'nei adam. We call them psychological robes. In the halacha, it's called the chazaka. What's the psychological robe here? She'ena mekalkelas atzmo. She doesn't want to expose herself to be vulnerable to the terrible repercussions of in case she's lying and he's alive. Eser atzmo zev el zev tafsi ksubasa vizev totzi v'totzi, as both of them have to divorce her, and boner mamzerin. Okay. Now, at this point, what I'd like you to do is underline the next three words, and I'm not going to read them. I'm going to skip those words for pedagogical reasons.
I wondered why you stopped there.
Okay. Now, at the end of the Rambam, v'chein. Now, when the Rambam says v'chein, that also has very great significance. In ba eid echad v'heid lo shemeis b'ayma. Inasei al piv. And these three words I want to read to you and emphasize. Shadavar asui ligolos. A man would not lie about something that we will check out in the future whether he's telling the truth or not. Because once again, the late husband's come in and he's walking on 2 feet. Like I remember, Rav Soloveitchik used to take the attendings. There were 100 guys in the shir. So he called on Schwartz to read the Gemara after he finished the attendings. So Schwartz says, Rebbe, he couldn't come to it. So the Rav says, all right, you read it. But then there was another case where he got to a name on the list and nobody answered. And the Rav was very upset. He took out a pencil. He crossed his name off. That's like, Ritzicha kind. You're off the list. Anyway, a minute later, the guy comes running. He says, Rebbe, I'm here. So the Rav says, Ba harug baraglam. That's a sugya in Sanhedrin. You testify about something that he died while he's walking on 2 feet. So this is what the Rambam says. We're going to believe Eid Echad because the Milsa Davidu L'Gluye. We'll figure out one way or the other whether he's lying. He would be totally stupid if he lied on something, and we're going to clarify down the line. His reputation is completely shot. Now, the
Rambam is the same. I don't know if that's what they're getting, equating the beer to the Eid Echad. At the end of the day,
is the Rambam? Wait, I'm going to give you two choices, Eli. Is the Rambam combining Har Ne'emonis and his, or is he separating between them?
Well, he's her.
Oh, that's another question. Where the Rambam put Daiko Mitzvah? No, what I'm
that's
asking you.
that's what he's explaining. Daiko Mitzvah that's the chazaka.
The rest of it go by her.
Well, no, I don't know if this is Daiko Mitzvah. We're talking about a case where she testifies that she saw him die. He's dead. But I'm asking you, when you look at the different explanations of the Rambam respectively for Har Ne'emonis and the Eid Echad, are they equivalent? Notice that in the case of Har Ne'emonis, the Rambam has this chazak about kilkul. She doesn't want to be makalkal herself. When he gets to Eid Echad, there's no issue of kilkul because the Eid Echad is not really going to suffer any terrible repercussions other than loss of
Only davar asur ligolos.
Right.
but on davar asur ligolos. So in a sense, this seems to indicate against the Ours what's his name? The Atzei Arazim that assume that Eid Echad and Isha is one and the same. So if you take a look again back in the Otzer Ayunim, I'm jumping back and forth. He says the following: Ubipnei Moshe. That's the third line in the paragraph of the Sefer Atzei Arazim. And who this Pnei Moshe is, I have no clue. It's not the same Pnei Moshe as the commentary on the Yerushalmi. The Pnei Moshe writes, look at the Rambam. And after he quotes the whole Rambam, he says, Avol nemonos isha kasav esatam shechmir lo b'sofa. Right, that's the kilkul. So he assumes, the Pnei Moshe, that there are two fundamentally different reasons why we trust her and him, right? The Eid Echad and the Isha. In the case of the Isha, it's all about the kilkul. It's hechmir lo b'sofa. In the case of Eid Echad, it's all about Milsa Davidi Ligluya. The only thing is, and this is my own comment, let's go back to the three words that I skipped. If you go back to the three words that I skipped, when the Rambam describes why we trust the Isha, and he gives this whole spiel about Chazaka, Shein Mikalkelos Atzmo, etc., etc. And after that, he writes the Davar HaOsui Galos, the same three identical words that he employs with regard to Eid Echad. I would use this Rambam Pukfaket as a riot to the Atzei Rosen that it's all one halacha. It's all about Davar HaOsui Galos. So I think what the Pnei Moshe is saying is that the Rambam in the case of an Isha needs a little bit of an extra booster. Okay? Extra chisun. I don't know if to have one. I don't know if to have two. What number are they up to now? 5? I stopped at 2. I jumped out. I can't go into Australia, but okay. Anyway, so what's the extra chisun that the Rambam gives? He says, well, she's afraid of the kilkul. Add that to the fact that it's a dover asim golos. And the truth is that the Pnei Moshe probably understood that the asim golos in the case of the Isha is only about kilkul. It's not a separate reason in and of itself why we trust her. We trust her because she's afraid of the repercussions, period. And it's shalom and so forth and so on.
Why is she afraid of it? The only way that there will be repercussions if later on, Davar Tzvah Galos.
Correct, but again, the reason
Even if he
why-
never shows up, she's lying.
Right.
She still hasn't heard.
Even if he never shows up.
If she's lying the whole it's never legal. She knows herself that it's a
Okay,
moral.
but she probably doesn't care, meaning at
Oh,
that point
gotcha.
she doesn't care, right? The only reason she would care is for somehow if she gets exposed.
Correct, he shows up. But the point is that the Rambam is not just saying because she'll get caught with a lie. That's not enough. In the case of Eid Echad, all the Rambam says she'll get caught lying because he is the Baal, Bahar Garaki, he's lying well. But in the case of the Isha, the Rambam only adds ligolos, also ligolos as just a condition to explain why she's afraid. But the reason why she's believed is because she's afraid. And that's how the Pnei Moshe understood. I would understand it that the Rambam is trying to make even a greater case to believe an Isha than to believe in Eid Echad. In Eid Echad, you only have, let's say, one element, call it A. In the case of Isha, you have A plus B. First, she doesn't want to get caught in a lie, just like nobody wants to get caught lying, to stand in front of Bezdin and fabricate a story. And number 2, she's afraid of the repercussions.
But Anisha has more weaknesses than an Eid Echad. She has a weakness that she's an Ugay B'Davar, the Marishon. She has a second weakness that she's not an Eid Kosher.
Right.
So that may be why he needs the
So
additional.
this entire article here that you're looking at, page, what is it, Ben? Hey, let me get it right. Hey, is all about these 2 approaches. In other words, on the hierarchy, you've got a pyramid. Where do you place Eid Echad? Where do you place Isha? Is Isha more believable, more trustworthy than him because she has this this fear of Sofa? Or on the contrary, Isha's low down on the totem compared to Eid. And this entire essay here is a beautiful piece of work in which he proves that she has more credibility than an Eid Echad. And her status and her authority, her power, and what we're lining up goes way beyond Eid Echad. And just to do a quick job as to highlight these nafkaminas, he says, for example, if you take a look in the Yerushalmi, which is on the bottom right here on page Memnei, Yerushalmi says that there was a Mishnah Rishona and a Mishnah Achrona. At the time of the Mishnah Rishona, they did not believe Eid Echad to testify about the death of her husband. And later on, historically, at the time of the Mishnah Achrona, they decided to upgrade the status and the authority and the reliability of Eid Echad, and now we're going to rely on Eid Echad. Says the Yerushalmi. And Lo start Mishnah Rishon. Again, what's the Mishnah Rishon? Do we accept Eid Echad or not? No go. Even according to the Mishnah Rishona, says the Yerushalmi, Eid Echad Matir, he materis liatzmo. She is believed. And the next paragraph, he has a piece from the Chelkas Yov, of Yoel Breish, I think was his last name, and he builds mountains on this Yerushalmi. He says the following, that if you take a look in the Sugya on Daf Kuf Chaf Beis, I think that's tomorrow's Daf, the Gemara says that according to Rama Gamliel, they made a takana to believe Eid Echad. Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua rejected, and that takana. However, even according to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Yeshua, who don't rely on Eid Echad, now we're on the top left column, hatakana shel meis baili nitkana od kodem beit Shammai and Beis Hillel. Historically, we're turning the clock back to before Rabbi Eliezer and Rabbi Yeshua. You follow? There are two generations. There are basically three generations here. There's one generation of Beis Hillel, Beit Shammai, and before them, we only rely on her. Then we get to the first generation where we reject Eid Echad, and then we get to the last generation where we accept Eid Echad. But one thing is clear, that even before they made the takana, it was in the middle period, to accept Eid Echad and rely on his Eidus, even at that point, they relied on her testimony. That's the first greatest proof.
Meaning, was the conditions always there?
I assume, because that's Beis Hillel Beit Shammai in the mission that we have here on this page. And he has another nafkamina. Listen to this. So again, in the paragraph it came on, he summarized it at the end, and he says, now, why would they have accepted that credibility of a woman when we're still before the Mishnah Achrona and we haven't yet accepted Eid Echad? What superiority does she have? And the plus that she has is because Shalot to calculus atzma, meaning sofa hifmir lev sofa. So at this point, I getting back to Howie's point, I'm sorry, I remember Howie from the old days. So according to what Tzvi is saying, that despite all the drawbacks of Isha, nevertheless she still is superior and goes beyond, exceeds, and supersedes the Nemanis and the beer of Eid Echad. Why? Because she's now look at these nafkaminas. The Ramah quotes in Shulchan Aruch Ibn Ezer, Siman Yud Zayin, right? All the laws of Aguna on Siman Yud Zayin. By the way, anyone who gets smicha or dayanas in Ibn Ezer will probably spend, I'd say, 50% of his preparation on Siman Yud Zayin, and then the rest he'll spend on Shemitz and Gid. But in any event, he says in the name of Rabbeinu Yerucham, Af Shota Nemenes Lomar Meis Barley. But both say in Eid Echad Yisur, would you trust the Shota? For sure not. But in Meis Barley, we will trust the Shota. Take a look at Rabbi Kiveger in the next paragraph. Ketana. She's not yet a Bogeres, and she testifies that her husband died. Let's say she was married off by whom? By her father. So we're dealing with the Suin Doraisa. And we're going to be matter her from the Suin Doraisa without a get. Based on her own testimony, the girl is all of 11 years old. As I state Rabbi Kiveger. Then we have another nafkamina. This again, the Chelkas Yoel.
What page are you on here?
I'm sorry, on Mem
Mem
Hey.
Hey.
Right?
Left column,
Left column on Mem Hey.
fifth paragraph.
He has another nafkamina for the Chelkas Yoel, based on the Radbaz. Right, the Radbaz is 5 centuries ago in Egypt, and the Radbaz is saying, "Shegam isha she gazla mit." The Torah will rely on her testimony that her husband died, even though she's a no good thief. Reminds me, by the way, my wife tells me, on Grand Street in Manhattan, where she is now, they closed one of the major branches of, I forget which company it is, because it's just not worth it. No one's taking care of the thieves. They're stealing left and right. It's wild. And that was another Simon that I made a decision, that made the right decision to come to Efrat. Okay, I'm always looking for Simon. Anyway, he says, you see the next paragraph? Okay, this is a sugya daf kuftes zayin with a tosus. So let me just look at the clock. All right, we'll try to do this fast, but I just want to, I want to see over and over again that the agenda here to convince us that she has nemonis that goes way beyond his meaning in Eid Echad. And again, we'll quote what Tzvi said before, she's a Valdova. As an Eid Echad, she could not be believed. She could not gain the status of Eid. And it's all about what we call BiIyun. I'll give you an example. I always love this example. You know that in Chulin it says that you can rely, if let's say milk falls into meat, you can rely on what's called ti'imas kfela. The kfela is a guy. A guy has no nemonis in Allah. He can never be an aid. And the answer is there's a chazaka. Why? Because if he tells us that there's no taste of milk and then we eat it, and we say, well, he's fired. Like Ramosha's true about chalav akum, chalav stav in America, right? If they get caught, passing on pilsner, pig's milk, the penalties are so incredible. So it's not that we're believing I'm probably dating myself. Elmhurst, what is it today? Anyway, we're not trusting Elmhurst. See, if you follow this, there's such a fundamental chakira here. To what extent are we relying on the testimony of somebody, meaning we trust that person? Or to what extent is it just a matter of that person giving us, supplying for us external evidence? I emphasize the word external.
That's what's happening. That's what's happening.
But the question now
We're not believing her.
is it a separate category? Is it a separate category different than Eid Echad? You see, in Eid Echad, what ultimately we want to do, and again, that's according to Tosfos the Russian, the second, right, his opinion, we want to upgrade the status of the Eid Echad to Ne'emanos. We may have to exclude any sort of Chashat Sheker, because if the Eid Echad is Chashat al Sheker, then we can't give them Ne'emanos. But at the end of the day, according to at least the second opinion of Tosfos the Russian, if you go back to page 7, we're relying on the Eid Echad. In the case of the Isha, we're just relying on this external evidence, this raya, this umdana, this hochacha, whatever word you want to use, that's external to Hanemus. And once we rely on that, it could be that it's going to be upgraded to a higher status than even the Ne'emanos of Eid Echad. We're talking about a shota, we're talking about a kata, we're talking about a gazlanit, and then when we get to Tosfos, talking about, I'm going to use a Hebrew word, shakranit. What's the case of Tosfos? Again, we don't have time to go. It's a beautiful Tosfos. If you work it through, you have to sweat it through. But Tosfos is machadinj that if a woman says, quote, Yerashtani, my husband gave me a gift. Ifnei plonu plonu, in front of the following two agents, she mentions them by name. We knock on their doors and they deny the whole story. We know that she's a shakranit. Tomorrow, the same woman comes into Bezdin and testifies, my husband died. And we believe her, according to Tosfos. In Yiddish, we say, "Stelz up forward." Could you imagine what's going on over here? This same woman 24 hours ago told me a lie through her teeth that in front of these two guys, she gave me get. So now she tries another one, right? My husband died. We're going to rely on it. Over and over again, all these nafkaminas. It's such a beautiful shtickle Torah. It's an anthology of so much to prove that her persuasive, the reliability that she has is greater even than an Eid Echad. And we're dealing with a new category. Again, how do you define a new category? It depends. If you're going to say that Eid Echad is also just BiIyun, then I'm only going to say this is a better BiIyun. The two BiIyuns. And this is one notch. Oh, it's not even a qualitative distinction. It's really a quantitative. But if, on the other hand, you're going to take the approach that Eid Echad is Ne'eman. He's not a Gazlan. He's not Choshen al Sheker. He has Ne'emanis. He's a Yehudi Kosher. He's got a Chazak and Peskas Kashrus, etc., etc. Then, if you understand that she exceeds beyond an Eid Echad, then what we're saying is that if you have Ne'emanis of Eid Echad on one side, and we compare it to the birur of an Isha on the other side, because she's afraid of Kilkul, then the birur element is even greater than Ne'emanis. Of course, that's almost impossible if you assume Gzeras HaMelech. Because if you can assume Gzeras HaMelech, that there's no difference between Eid Echad and Shnei Eidim, it's very difficult to accept that the birur is better than and superior to Ne'eman. So just to summarize, we have all these nafkaminas here between the Ne'emanis of an Isha and that of an Eid Echad. And it seems that over and over again, consistent, we have more of a reliance on her than on an Eid Echad in many, many different cases. And the takana to believe her was a takana keduma that predated the takana of Eid Echad. And there are two ways of understanding. One way of understanding that is that the birur of Isha is greater than the ne'emanis of Eid Echad, if you're assuming Gzeras HaMelech, the first opinion of the Tosfos. And the other way of saying it is that really it's all the same. Whether it's Eid Echad, whether it's Isha, it always comes down to birur in a separate zaytik. We call it a chazaka chitzonis, like Pela, or like, for example, Masechet Lefitumo, like a person's Masechet Lefitumo. The Gemara tells us in the Masechet BiIyun that they overheard children. It says Tinokos, I don't know what age they were, talking about the funeral of so-and-so. And they mentioned the so-and-so by name, and they went in, they were matir to get married. Could you imagine Tinokos? Masechet Lefitumo, a guy tells a story. Do you remember the sugya? Where's on Kuf Yudzayit? The Gemara tells a story about a guy who threatens a Jew. He says, if you're not Machal Shabbos by cutting down Aspasta, I'm going to behead you. So it's the same way I beheaded someone. So the question is whether we trust him or not. And he's a guy who doesn't have ne'emanis, especially he's a murderer by his own self-incrimination. And the Gemara says that maybe we can rely on him. Again, the Gemara goes back and forth, but maybe we can rely on him because he's Masechet Lefitumo. He didn't come in to testify. He was telling us a story. Unbelievable. Okay, I just want to end with a little divrei chizuk from this week's parsha, the last 5 minutes that we have. How do we understand the antithetical nature of Bilam against Moshe? This is, I think, perhaps the central motif of Bilam. Represents someone who on the outside looks like a professor. He's intellectual. He wears Phi Beta Kappa dangling from his this. He's got 1,600 talents. I mean, he's like the perfect guy. He's so eloquent in his speech that many of the things that come out of his Tovadika mouth, we say in our davening, Musaf on Rosh Hashanah. Every day we walk into a shul, we say, "Ma Tov Olecha Yaakov." This comes from the mouth of a Bilam. But in contrast, we have a Moshe. Moshe Rabbeinu is not as eloquent, perhaps. He doesn't have that flowery language, that poetry of a Bilam, but he's sincere. What you see is what he is, and it goes beyond that. I heard once my Rebbe of Soloveitchik that, and we mentioned it last night, Adam, that the nevuah of Moshe Rabbeinu was really part of himself. And whenever Moshe Rabbeinu says anything about Klal Yisrael, you could be sure that he's emotionally involved. If Moshe Rabbeinu is Chas v'Shalom predicting Golus, he's crying over the tsar of Golus together with Klal Yisrael. And if Moshe Rabbeinu is predicting, Truas Melech Bo, that there'll be great salvation, Moshe Rabbeinu is dancing, he's happy, he's sincere. Rashi says about Bilam, it's just the opposite. He describes Bilam's nevuah as like a fisherman, puts something into the mouth of the fish. God puts what's called a bridle, how do you say it in English? Into the mouth of Bilam, and he forces the words to come out of his mouth. That's not Bilam. Bilam inside is right into the core. He's going to give the Eitzah that's going to bring down a large segment of Klal Yisrael. And I think, again, just to add my own little piece, I think this is something that we have to take with us when we look at contemporary society. And we can be so fooled by people who are eloquent. Again, I don't want to say anything about politicians. I'm not the type of guy to talk about politics, but sometimes they're so good at convincing us and persuading us. And last but not least, because I think it really fits in, and I like to quote Reb Nosson of Breslov. Reb Nosson says an amazing thing, that those who try to undermine Judaism, like a Bilam or Russia, are going to glorify Teva. Everything is about nature. Everything is about physics and chemistry and biology. We are mishubadim. We're totally controlled. There's nothing above Teva. And God forces Bilam against his will to eloquently describe that there is something above Teva, that Klal Yisrael is above Teva. And Rabbi Nosson says the real battleground between Bilam and Moshe is all about fuel. It's all about the power. And Bilam is not willing to accept the concept of prayer, because that would mean changing faith Eva, and we're totally mature with Eva. But Klal Yisrael believes in the ultimate, the infinite, unlimited power of tefillah above Teva. And when Klal Yisrael reach a point of urgency, and they're standing at Yom Tov, and they cry out, when Yoshua is urgently crying out, Shemesh b'Givon Dom, when Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah are in the lion's den, and they're crying out to Hashem, the koch of tefillah is such that it overrides, it trumps Teva. And what we are able to do through our tefillah is we're able to convert the Ratzon Hashem into our Ratzon. And it's a two-way street. On the one hand, as the Mishnah says, Ritzoni lasses Ritzonecha, and I'm trying to be Meshabed my Ratzon so that my will will be your will, but it goes the other way around too. We can actually have an impact on the divine will. And God's will be our will. And we're capable of doing this through our tefillah. So Yiratzah made his will, that we should be Zochem Ritz Hashem. Appreciate the difference between a Moshe Rabbeinu and I don't even want to say his name, and to appreciate the koch that we have above Teva and all the nisim and the flows. And Yiratzah will be Zocher to see those nisim and flows by Yom HaYim.
Amen.
I don't see the source of consensus.
Pressures are really fun.
Are you looking?
Either way, that allows a woman. Is that we're accepting? But the entire last paragraph seems to be that you don't. It is a head to remarry. Beis Hillel suggests that they're asking to Bishop, right? That Sarah is not allowed to remarry based on this. If this was able to be accepted, and that we've now established he's dead, and you cannot say that.
It shouldn't be relative.
Rabbi Tarfon suggests it should apply to everybody. She's married to us. I think the underlying point that I'm trying to get at with little last parents is that this is not a. This is a special header for her to remarry, and it's only that. And this is why the rush sounds like it's so perfect with all this. We don't need to get into any questions of ADOS. There's no comparing. There's no ADOS that accept it. There's a specific head to for her to remarry. Okay, does that? Then the question do to I made the go. In the that's what the rest folks because there's no there are other ways to explain, but even if we're going to sit for some sort of it's surely different than the ages, whether it's AF or it's an ages that Contradictory. She can remarry, the tzara can't remarry. Tzara is not allowed to remarry. Even when I'm with the case with tzara disagrees. The tzara says
There's
no.
even a hobby to say that she's so interested in messing up the Torah, that we should say. to her,
No, even if the tzara says he's not dead, we might give her a head.
Yeah.
That on the other side. The tzara,
I'm
if
saying
the
there's a
tzara says
hobby
not,
that if she's motivated to mess up the Torah, that she won't even be holy for herself.
correct. And the other, the Mishnah says the tzara is not allowed to remarry. But if the tzara disagrees and says, no, he didn't die, in that case, what's the tzara remarry? Because there's so much psychology and there's so, as opposed to the question of Eidach Hanam Bisuri. I have a pot of food here, is it kosher or not kosher? There's not so much invested in whether it's kosher or not. Relationships, who's married to who, there's so much baggage that comes with that. There's so many reasons to be able to lie in every sort of direction.
Right, for this left.
We need these chazak.
Could you tell ways how I can drive to Geffen?
Going to shul?
And I'll drive behind you. if you're
Sure.
doing that.
Yeah.
But still, just in case I want to have ways.
Shia, you're.
Yeah, what you
Remind
press
us.
N.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the.
I'm just telling you,